If I asked you what the most important tool for British expansion was, what would you say? Most people would probably think of the Royal Navy. After all, the British Navy was basically a global superpower with no rivals. But here's the thing. That answer isn't quite right. In fact, 100 years before Britain's powerful warships ruled the sea, its overseas expansion was already in full swing. And the ones leading the charge? Not the Royal Navy. They were a handful of mega corporations. Seriously, without these companies, there would be no British Empire. It's that simple. And if you want to understand exactly how these companies worked, stick around. Welcome to my channel, The Deep Code of British Rise. Here, we don't just tell history. We decode the deep secrets behind Britain's rise, exploring the institutions, strategies, and forces that shaped one of history's greatest powers. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic chapters, the Joint Stock Company. Back in the mid-16th century, Britain was kind of a late bloomer in the age of discovery. Spain and Portugal were already rolling in riches from their sea routes, while Britain was still scratching its head, trying to find its own shortcut to the east. So in 1553, a bunch of London merchants teamed up with the navigator Sebastian Cabot and decided to go all in. They created a joint stock company called the Company of Merchant Adventurers with one bold mission: find a northeast passage to China. The English king even wrote a letter to the Emperor of China to be delivered in Beijing. Ambitious, right? But, as it often does, fate had a sense of humor. 3 wooden ships set sail. 2 were lost to the icy sea. Only one, captained by Richard Chancellor, somehow made it through the Arctic Ocean, and instead of China, he ended up in the White Sea right in front of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. The English had to do a quick rewrite, tuck their letter to the Chinese emperor, and address it to the great monarch of the East instead. And to everyone's surprise, the Russians loved it. They welcomed the English, and just like that, Britain got a monopoly on trade with Russia. What was meant to be a shortcut to China accidentally opened a whole new trading route to Russia. The Muscovy Company was born in 1555, becoming Britain's first royal chartered company. It dominated Anglo-Russian trade for over a century, and even after losing its monopoly in 1698, it kept going all the way until the October Revolution in 1917. Who would have thought that Britain's very first overseas adventure started with a voyage to China that went hilariously, spectacularly wrong? Next up, the Levant Company, born in 1581. The Levant is just an old-school name for the Eastern Mediterranean. Think modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Back then, all of it was part of the Ottoman Empire. From day one, the Levant Company had a crystal-clear mission: sell British wool and other goods, and open up trade routes with the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Pretty clever, right? This was Britain's way of sneaking past the Spanish and Venetians, who were basically blocking them out of the Mediterranean. Queen Elizabeth I gave the company a royal charter, granting it a monopoly on all trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. But they weren't just setting up trading posts in Istanbul and Aleppo. Oh no, they were doing diplomacy too. The company's top merchants basically acted as Britain's official representatives in the Ottoman Empire. Imagine that, your local trader doubling as an ambassador. And suddenly, British wool, tin, and metal goods were flowing east, while spices, silk, and cotton were coming straight back to London. Trade was booming. The Levant Company quickly became one of Britain's biggest and most important overseas trading groups, far bigger than the Muscovy Company. It kept running strong until 1825, when it finally closed shop as Britain moved toward free trade. And finally, we get to the big one. On Christmas Eve in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed the Royal Charter that created the East India Company. Its starting capital? A jaw-dropping £60,000, an insane fortune back then. But what really set this company apart wasn't just the money, it was its ambition. Unlike the Muscovy or Levant companies, the East India Company was after a much bigger prize, a complete monopoly on all British trade, by land and sea, with the entire East. What started as a few ships hunting spices quickly turned into something nobody could have imagined. The company didn't just trade, it conquered. It had its own armed fleets, private armies, collected taxes, fought wars, and built a full-blown political empire. By the 18th century, this corporate machine had India firmly in its grip. Then came the Indian Mutiny of 1857, a huge rebellion that finally stripped the company of its power. Just 1 year later, in 1858, the British government stepped in and took over. By 1874, the company was completely gone. But here's the wild part. What it left behind: a brand new British Empire. So think about this. How did a company that started with just a handful of merchants end up running an entire continent? Looking at a map, it's almost like these three companies were drawing three parallel routes for Britain to push eastward. The Muscovy Company took the northern route, slogging over the icy seas to Russia. The Levant Company handled the middle path, moving along the eastern Mediterranean into Central Asia. And the East India Company? They went all out on the southern route, sailing around Africa's Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. On one hand, these companies were just funneling eastern wealth and goods straight back to London. But on the other hand, they were like three spearheads, pushing Britain's influence deep into Eurasia. It was through these corporate adventures that Britain's overseas trade and its empire-building ambitions were really launched onto the world stage. And guess what? These weren't the only players. Soon came the Virginia Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, and of course, the infamous South Sea Company. You know, the one that even made Sir Isaac Newton lose a fortune. So here's the big question. How did Britain, a total underdog compared to Spain and Portugal, suddenly get these massive companies up and running in the 16th century? How did they become so ridiculously powerful? And maybe the most interesting part, why were a bunch of merchants so ready to do the government's bidding? The short answer: systemic thinking. Back in the day, Spain and Portugal were way ahead. Britain was basically playing catch-up. But crossing the ocean was no joke. One failed voyage, and you could lose everything. The British monarchy was broke. And individual merchants were too scared to risk it all. Enter the joint stock company, their genius solution. Everyone chips in a little money, and suddenly you've got a huge pool of capital. That way, a small group of adventurers could set out. And if things went south, nobody lost their life savings. What seemed like an impossible gamble became a legit business. But here's the real brilliance. It wasn't just about sharing risk. It was about uniting goals. Investors had their own plans. The company pulled them into one common purpose. And the government stepped in with royal charters. These weren't just business licenses. They granted monopolies, which meant massive profits. And the government got a cut too. Boom. Private money and state power working together. Take the Muscovy Company. Just a decade after it was founded, it got a charter allowing it to explore anywhere in the world. And British officials had to help. Basically, the government saying, "We've got your back." The Levant Company went even further. The British government itself was an investor, and Queen Elizabeth I put money in directly. Even the British ambassador to Turkey was paid by the Levant Company. Talk about tight teamwork. So here's the deal. These joint stock companies weren't lucky accidents. They were a system born of necessity. Shared risk turned high-stakes adventures into real enterprises. Private money and state muscle joined forces. And together, they built the foundation of the British Empire. But there's a deeper point here. It's not just about history. It's about the power of systems. We think of systems as boring rules, but the right system can unite completely different goals into one giant purpose. The joint stock company is the perfect example. Individual goals, business goals, national goals, somehow all woven together. It was like an invisible hand, mobilizing the strength of an entire nation. And to really see how far this could go, we have to look at one case, the most famous of all, the East India Company. Next time, we'll follow its journey from a trading business to a global superpower. Brilliant, terrifying, unstoppable. If you've been enjoying this series, don't forget to hit like and follow. The next one's going to be even better.